A Chateau Under Siege: A Mystery of the French Countryside. Chapter 1. Bruno Correz, chief of police for Verlet Valley in Perdon region of France, was deeply fond of the medieval square of Sarlat, but he had never seen it from this angle before. He was seated among his friends on one of the top rows of benches, and it felt uncomfortably high. Erected each year from the town's theatre festivals, the benches were being used for a new venture, the reenactment of the Battle of Sarlat in 1370, when the town had been liberated from England's rule. As a former soldier, Bruno was interested to see how this mock battle would unfold. Sarlat was the traditional capital of the Perlogue Noir, dating back to Gallo-Roman times, and Charlemagne himself donated holy relics to the abbey here, said Pamela. She sat on Bruno's left and was reading aloud from a guidebook as Bruno gazed fondly at the former lover who had since become the closest female friend he'd ever known. That's how it became rich, attracting pilgrims who ensured its growing prosperity. Over time, the monks established 85 daughter churches, whose parishes by the year 1200 stretched nearly 200 kilometers to Tourles, all while preaching the virtues of poverty, grumbled Gerald Magan, sitting on Bruno's right. As the mayor of St. Denis, Magan had been hired Bruno to be the town policeman more than 10 years earlier. And Bruno, an orphan, sometimes thought of himself as the father he had never known. The mayor was a staunch Republican who went to the church when baptism, funeral, or civic duties required. Weddings he believed were civic events for him to officiate rather than any priest. A dozen of Bruno's friends from St. Denis were clustered around them. The baron was one of Bruno's hunting partners, sitting on the far side of Pamela. Febolia, a local doctor, and her partner, Gilles, a journalist, were on the bench below beside Bruno's cousin, Alain and Rosalie. The woman, Alain, who married later that year, once their 20-year service in Armée de Air was complete. On the row below them were Miranda, Pamela's partner in the riding school, and Miranda's father, Jack Crimson, a retired British diplomat. The only one missing was Florence, a local science teacher, who had lost the toss of a coin with Miranda to see which of the two mothers would babysit their young children, all of them exhausted after a long day around Pamela's pool. It had been for Bruno a perfect day, undisturbed by any of the sudden crises that had ruined his previous Fridays and Sundays. Normally, his days off. These traffic accidents, 2 lost children, and a drunken duel between 2 Dutch tourists in kayaks had around Pamela's swimming pool with his friends. No, kayaks had consumed his supposed free time, but today he spent in and around Pamela's swimming pool with his friends, and while preparing lunch for them all, he enjoyed showing the children how to make deviled eggs. They had watched him have the hard-boiled eggs, scoop out the yolks, crush them with a fork, and then make mayonnaise. He added a little red wine vinegar and some Dijon mustard, and then whipped up the mixture with a little sunflower oil until it began to thicken. He added a squeeze of half a lemon and whisked some more until the mayonnaise reached the firmness he wanted. Next he used a fork to mix in the crumbled egg yolks, then scooped the egg and mayonnaise mix into a dozen of the eggs for the grown-ups. He asked the children how they liked their eggs. With ketchup, they replied. So Bruno put the remaining mayonnaise in a dish and showed them how to stir and ketchup until it turned pink. He added the crumbled yolks and scooped the mixture into half whites and grinned as the kids darted away to show off their pink deviled eggs. He smiled to himself at the memory until Pamela interrupted his thoughts to ask whether today's planned reenactment was historically accurate. As usual, that depends on whose version of history you read, the mayor said. Only later did English and the French historians make it matter of national patriotism. At that time, most people in the region accepted that the local lord was the Duke of Anti- uh, Antiquine, who had happened to be half English, and he didn't speak their language, nor did the King of France, because everyone around here spoke Occitan. The English duke's taxes were usually lower, and England was the main market for our wines. Whoever built Saltar, they left us a lovely town, said Bruno. He never tried You never tired of visiting the old town, a jewel of medieval and Renaissance architecture, so well preserved that it had become a manistee of French historic films. Its markets and festivals for local delicacies of truffles and foie gras were renowned. Saltar was woven deeply into history of France. It was lost and then liberated in the Hundred Years' War against the English. It had again been a battlefield in the 16th century in France's Civil War, when Catholic fought Protestants so long and so bitterly that more than 2 million died, a tenth of the French population. From war and plague and famines, the marring armies brought in their wake. Sartar's launch of this tourist event had certainly attracted great interest. There were TV cameras, radio, and press reporters, and not an empty seat in the giant array of benches that had been erected in the main square. The town had provided a lavish budget for the medieval costumes and musicians to commemorate this great patriotic occasion, when the townsfolk of Sarlat had risen against the English from within while French troops stormed the gates. The idea had been borrowed from the annual reenactment of the Battle of Castelli in 1453, when the English army, led by renowned John Talbot, the Earl of Salisbury, had been deceptively defeated. The Rosbifs, as the French called their tradition, enemies from across the Channel, had finally been ejected from southern and western France for good, with only the Channel ports of Calais remaining in English hands for another 100 years. Every summer, the people of the town of Castelli, now known as Castelli-le-Bati, in commemoration of this victory, mounted a popular pageant. It featured crowd scenes and parades, knights in armor charging on horseback, picketed tents and flags, and the roar of a cannon that had been the key to the French victory, opening the way for the French to take the strategic port of Bordeaux, just a day's march away. As former soldier, Bruno had always wondered why the name of Jean Béraud had been forgotten, since the great victory of Casson had been his. As a master of ordnance for the French king, Béraud had assembled 300 cannon and mounted them behind a devilish ditch. The guns had a greater range than the longbows of the hitherto invincible French archers. It was therefore a battle which lent itself to reenactment. The English stopped to shoot their longbows, and the guns roared out and the archers began to fall. Then the English infantry launched their doomed assaults, and the guns roared out again. And finally the French knights emerged on horseback for a triumphant charge. It was all very simple for tourists to understand, all very scenic, and with powerful sound effects. No wonder it was a success, thought Bruno. But of course the actual mock battle lasted barely 20 minutes, and the tourists wanted more than that. So there were scenes in French camps. They delivered a herd of sheep and cattle to feed the French troops, the market with fetching milkmaids and country dancing, and the musicians, the solemn blessing of the French troops by the patriotic churchmen, the donning of armor. These scenes were balanced by the absurd overconfidence of the English archers, unaware that the swarm of arrows that had won the battle for their past century was about to become obsolete as the cannon announced their new dominance over battlefields. It was all made for a grand and dramatic evening. Knowing something of the confusion of urban warfare, Bruno wondered how the libertarians of Sarlat would be stretched out for the planned 2 hours of spectate, which there was no ditch to be attacked and defended, no roar of massed cannons, no flight of arrows, and in the narrow streets of the medieval town that led to this main square, little prospects of scenic cavalry charge. Still, he could already hear the sounds of cattle and the bleating of goats and the livestock well prepared for their walk-on parts. These being the pergoid, they were echoed by the honking of geese and the clatter barrels of wine being rolled over cobblestones. These had been the sound that had greeted Bruno and his friends when they first arrived late afternoon to stroll through the medieval market that had been erected as a part of the entertainment. The stalls offered the usual sovereignty of knightly helmets for children, plastic swords and bows with rubber-tipped arrows, sold by men in leather jerkins and young women dressed as travel wrenches. Entering into the spirit of the evening, they watched the staged sword fights and brought overpriced glasses of something called mead, which Bruno recognized as a semi-sweet rosé white wine that was unique to Bergerac. They had dined cheerfully on overpriced barbecue, followed by paper cups on fresh strawberries. Finally, at 8:30, as the lovely soft twilight that the French called le crépuscule began to fall, a peal of trumpets summoned them to their seats. A man dressed as a medieval Herland appeared on of the balconies on the far side of the square. He was flanked by two musicians bearing long trumpets who sent out another peal that made everyone sit up. It lasted until the first roll of the drums, and then the Harlan spoke. France groaned beneath the English yoke, he announced. Ever since the Battle of Poitiers, when the English archers under their nurse Black Prince mowed down the flower of French cavalry, the English have occupied half of France. But now, in the summer of 1370, 10 years after the hateful treaty was imposed on our captured king, libertarians in stirring here in the lush valley of forest and vines of the Pergoid, Bertrand de Coustil, the Constable of France, and preparing to restore France to herself. The symbol that the Jesus chose for the great mission to recover France's freedom is here. In the cathedral city of Sarlat is prosperity founded by the great Chamonix and its renowned abbey. And armies then raised and bought secretly through the woods and the secret ways to the heart of Pergoy. Secret agents have been dispatched to make their way to Sarlat, disguised as peddlers and merchants, to make contact with the consuls of the people of Sarlat and prepare the way for the audacious stroke that will launch the fight of the libertarian of France. On the balcony across the square, curtains were being drawn back to reveal a group of men in period costumes, evidently conspirators, gathered around glistering candles and making angry speeches about Sarlat, began crushed beneath the English boot. Well, come in for the market dresses, like peasants, but with our swords hidden in a farm cart, said one of the conspirators. A hidden microphone sending his stage whispers through the loudspeaker that carried every word to the audience. We seized the town gatehouse and opened the gates for Duke Gaston Ghislain and his troops to ride in, while more of our men ambushed their archers, and our townswomen distract the enemy with their charms. The conspirators clasped their hands one after another, made brief but patriotic speeches, bowed before the crucifix, and then crossed themselves before declaring in the chorus, "Vive la France!" Bruno had expected the market scene to follow. No, declared the herald. It was still night-time in Sarlat, and the English troops were trouncing through the taverns, and his voice deepened ominously, molesting the womenfolk. And of course, no French soldier had ever been known to molest a woman, came Pamela's voice, dripping with sarcasm. She carefully avoided looking at Bruno, one of the few Frenchmen she knew who had been a soldier. But then she threw him a friendly glance, winked, and gave his hand an affectionate squeeze. He admired Pamela's energy, her intelligence, and her kindness, and he thoughtfully admired what she had done with her life. After divorcing her husband and moving to France, she always had the time for her friends, and when on the occasion she'd let know that she enjoyed his company for a romantic evening. He always found time for her. They exchanged a look that blended friendship with deep affection before suddenly a sound of an uproar drew their attention back to the square before them. English soldiers dressed in chainmail and leather hauberks, and their charismatic soup-plate metal helmets, thronged out from the side streets, most of them with leather tankards in one hand and a wrench in the other. Bruno assumed the women were supposed to be tavern girls. They were all wearing very low-cut dresses, and most of them seemed content enough to join in the party, taking sips from the men's tankard, dancing in time to the music, while clinging to a soldier's arm. But one young woman with flaming red hair, much more modestly dressed and clearly being dragged along against her will, weeping and crying out to be released from the clutches of a big and apparently drunken thug who was groping her. "This is going a bit far," muttered the mayor. "There are children in this audience." As he spoke, the group of English soldiers and women passed beneath the balcony not far from the conspirators had been clustered around their castle. A young man in hose and doublets appeared, looking down into the streets, and immediately launched himself from the balcony to drop onto the soldiers of the drunken hauling and the terrorized woman. The youth must have been a skilled gymnast, since he landed on the Englishman's burly soldiers, and at once somersaulted from them to land lightly on his feet on the cobblestones. The woman, that had evidently been experiencing this maneuver, tripped the stunned soldier so that they stumbled across their feet to his fellows, and she cried, "Down with the English tyranny!" She then seized the young gymnast's hand, and they disappeared together in a maze of alleys in the old town. The audience applauded, many of them, like Bruno and Alan, leaping from their seats to salute this theatrical coup. But they subsided as the English troops began taking their revenge, kicking in doors, rousting out with the townfolk and their nightshirts, sounds of breaking crockery and furniture, and screams coming from within. As last of patrol of sober soldiers appeared to restore order, to shepherd the weeping citizens back into their homes, and escort their drunken comrades back to their barracks. When all still again and the streets empty, the flame-heeled young women and agile youth who had rescued her came back into the main square, peeked around the corner to be sure they were alone. "It's all clear," the youth said. He whispered, carrying to the audience over some hidden microphone. "We planned to seize the gates and charge in just before midday, when the English gathered to eat before market close." "The people of Sarlat are ready, my lord," she replied. "We can make the roast beef drunk on wine before you come. The fools cannot resist the fruit of the grape." Nor can I resist you, mademoiselle. We saw that tonight, but then who could? Your beauty punts the stars to shame, and your eyes fill me with more light than the moon. He knelt to kiss her hand, and I am no lord, just a simple clavier, a squire to the great Constable du Glusson. When I get back over town wall, I shall tell him that the Sarlot will be ours by midday tomorrow. He gave her hand a final kiss, and she unwrapped the scarf from around her throat and handed it to him. May the good Lord and the Blessed Virgin Mary hear my prayers, and watch over it in the fighting tomorrow, she said before the young squire darted away. Silence fell until the church bell gave a single toll, and the herald emerged once again to announce, Scarlet sleepers here last night under English rule. Bernard de Glisson and his troops stand watch behind the heights of the west of the town. De Glusson's trusty squire, Philippe de Perrot, has returned from his bold mission inside the walls of Scarlet, and he reported that the town's patriots are ready. In the darkness beyond these walls, de Gusselin and his men are kneeling at prayers, and the hopes of all of France must wait through the long night and their long-awaited liberations. There was a long pause, and the thought of the loudspeaker came to the second of the carriole crowds to greet the dawn. Of a sudden all bustled as the spotlight came onto the light and the scene of with a flood of artificial day. Escorted by young girls and boys, a small herd of crows emerged into the main square. A young woman appeared carrying tools and sat down as if ready to milk them. Market stalls were being set up, and the housewives came to buy food. Amid sudden smells of fresh bread and pickled herring the English loved, over the loudspeaker came the crackling of fat moor ducks and chickens that could be seen in cages being unloaded from farm carts. Wooden carts with squeaky wheels and hauled by donkeys were bringing fruit and vegetables to the market. Then came the musicians, playing their critots and tambours, singing old tambour songs, while jugglers tossed two and three hatchets into the air at once and kept all spinning. A one-legged man dressed in rags, leaving a wooden clutch, holding out a bowl and begging for alms, leaped around the crowd and was listening to the music. The English soldier came out to patrol two by two, never alone. The richer citizens paraded in their fiery skills and embroidery, leather boots and shoes, rather than wooden sabots, in which peasants clattered on the cobblestones. The square filled steadily with the market, the people and the cries of the street vendors, the knife sharpeners, the wheel riders, shoe members, and wood turners. The high volumes of women called on people to feel the quality of lives that has fun. Children were darting between and beneath the stalls, picking up scraps, and their little hands crept from below to steal pastries. At every corner, planks were laid across two upright barrels, making stalls that were bearing jugs of wine and clay mugs, and the winemakers cried out that they had to sell their stock cheaply to make room in for their chaise for the year's harvest. A jug of wine for only 2 deniers, milord, called one of them to the English troops. Last week it cost 3 deniers, so it's a special price today. Soon the Englishmen had taken off their soup-dish helmets and were leaning against the church wall, swirling jugs of wine as they watched the jugglers. Then a horse-drawn cart, piled high with firewood, came down the hill, and two peasants began to unload it. Bruno noticed that, once empty, the floor of the cart seemed digitally higher than it should have been. A church bell began to toll, slowly and solemnly. The church doors opened and the priest emerged first, 6 peasants following behind him, carrying a coffin, while they bravely family trudged sadly in their wake, heading for the town's main gates and path that led to the cemetery. The herald emerged to announce that there was no funeral and no corpse. The mourners were the assault team who would attack the gates guards and open the gates for Dubuisson and his armored knights. From the direction of the gate came the sound of a cheering clash of swords, cries, and pain. The funeral party put down the coffin, wrenched off the lid, and pulled out their hidden weapons. The peasants who had brought in the cart filled with firewood leaved off the boards and made the cart's false floor and began handing out swords, pikes, and that had been hidden there, to the musicians and jugglers, who at once attacked the English patrols. Milkmaids who had been flirting with the soldiers plucked daggers from inside their robes and stabbed at the nearest Englishmen at arms who were putting aside their jugs of wine. Then the thundering clatter of horses' hoofs on cobblestone announced the arrival of the French knights, led by a big man on a white horse and wearing a black surcoat over his armor, evidently intended to be Berthaud de Gusson. With him were 3 knights in red surcoats, one of them carrying a fleur de lis banner, and 3 more in white. More horsemen were coming in their wake, and after a triumph ride along the front of the benches to the church cité, Marie de Gusson turned his horse, roaring out, "Vive la France!" He ordered his cavalry to charge the English troops guarding the Hôtel de Ville. Suddenly, de Gusson's horse seemed to skid on a lump of straw that had been placed on a steaming pile of fresh manure, and went down hard, whining in pain and sprawling on its rear leg. But Gusson scrambled free with his fellow knights. He continued to charge on foot, his great broadsword held high. The newly armed stallholder and some of their womenfolk followed him and his English knights in the attack up the third line of the Englishmen. From one side, a brawny milkmaid swinging a pole swiped at the legs of the Englishmen at arms. At the end of the line, at the other end, the beggar balanced fiercely on his one good leg and used his crutch to sweep away the feet beneath another roast-beef. Swords clashed against swords and slammed into shields. Pikes and battle-axes were brandished, but the French knights were steadily driven the enemies back to the steps, where the English defenders acted out dramatic deaths one by one. Turning to the sounds of more trumpets from behind, Bruno saw a squad of French soldiers marching into the view of the direction of the captured gatehouse. Disarmed English prisoners, their hands bound beneath their backs, trudged in their wake. The stalls selling wine hand stopped to offer mugs to the new French arrivals as the townfolk began to celebrate their liberation. One of the town's councils was trying to make a speech of welcome as the cry went up for the hero of the day, "Du Gusson de Gusson." But there came no answer, as the English troops lay sprawled in fake death against the front of the Hôtel de Ville, and the French knights and the townsfolk backed away, their arms at the drooping of solitary body remained sprawled face down on the steps. The body was wearing a black surcoat, and a pool of blood was spreading ominously from beneath him. As Bruno and the rest of the audience watched in growing apprehension, the first drop of blood overflowed the marble step and dribbled slowly to the next in sudden stunned silence. At the moment of his triumph, de Gusson had fallen. Another travesty of history, murmured the mayor. De Gusson lived on for 10 more years before dying of illness. I don't think this is in the script, said Bruno. That's the end of chapter 1.